established the Voices in Education series as part of Alumni Weekend to highlight some of the biggest issues and topics within education and to engage both our own alumni and the broader Penn community in these conversations. Our theme today is reimagining the future and talking with people who do a lot of work globally and focusing on the global work that Penn GSE does. At Penn GSE, 70% of the faculty are engaged with global work in one way or another, which sometimes surprises people because we talk a lot about our local impact. But we believe in this global and interconnected world, we need to be engaged, not just locally, but globally, to address some of the most pressing issues facing young people across the world. So we have 25% of our students are international students from all over the globe. We saw some of them graduate today. I was given chocolate from Kazakhstan as part of that. And again, our faculty undertake groundbreaking research, professional development, all kinds of activities around the world. So one of the things that you'll hear about today is some of the research that our faculty are doing, the kinds of work they're doing, and why they're doing it. So we're hoping that you'll have a chance to learn more about this. I'll start by having people introduce themselves and then open it up with some questions. And if we have time, we'll have more questions from the audience as well. So the panel today really includes some of our most eminent faculty who are doing global work. And I'm going to have them introduce themselves, and I'll start with Crystal Strong, Ameena Ghaffar-Kucher, Matt Hartley, and Alan Ruby. Crystal, do you want to start?
Sure. Hopefully you can hear me. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Sure. As Dean Grossman mentioned, my name is Crystal Strong. I'm an assistant professor in the Education, Culture, and Society program. My work geographically is mostly based in African countries, Nigeria, South Africa mostly. And my work really sits at a few thematic intersections. I'm centrally concerned with activism, especially young people's activism and involvement in political processes and work. I'm also interested in the relationship between schools and communities and broader processes of social and political transformation. Because my work is also so centrally focused with young people, I'm also thinking about the politics of new media and social media and popular culture. And I think we'll have an opportunity to hear more about some of the specific projects that I work on, but those are the sort of broad strokes of my work.
Good afternoon. My name is Ameena Ghaffar-Kucher, and I'm a senior lecturer in the Literacy, Culture, and International Education program, where I'm also the co-director of the International Educational Development Program. And my research interests are in the academic achievement, socialization, and civic commitments of young migrant youth in particular, and also issues pertaining to school climate, including anti-bias bullying, xenophobia, Islamophobia. And currently, I'm in the midst of a national study sponsored by the Spencer Foundation, where we're looking at the civic commitments or civic engagement of young youth from Muslim immigrant communities throughout the United States. And so thus far, we've talked to over 200 young people from over 10 states and DC, 18 cities across the country, and we're still collecting data and interviewing more youth. But what we're seeing already at this preliminary juncture is that there's a real generational shift in the way these young people are seeing themselves as civic actors and the kind of commitments that they have towards their own affinity groups and other affinity groups as well. And so lots of exciting things happening there, and hopefully at some point in the future I'll be able to share more about that, but I'll leave that for now here.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Matt Hartley. I'm the Associate Dean and a Professor of Higher Education at GSE, and also serve as the co-executive director of a center at the school called the Alliance for Higher Education and Democracy, or AHED, with my colleague Laura Perna. And My research focuses on academic governance and the management of colleges and universities, and trying to understand how organizations and higher systems change. And the current project I'm involved in with Alan, we're developing a series of 10 case studies of universities in a wide range of national contexts that are doing what we think is very deep and impactful work for their students and for their localities. Now, these are all institutions that are never going to be in the top 100 of any international ranking. But they're embodying excellence of a different kind. And so we're hoping to sort of surface those alternative conceptions of excellence in this project.
Good afternoon. I'm Alan Ruby. I'm a senior fellow in the Higher Education Division. I work with Matt in the Alliance for Higher Education and Democracy. The Dean is my boss for my other responsibility, which is that I head up the Graduate School of Education's Global Engagement Office, which is 1 year and 2 months old. My other interest, in addition to the Institutions of Excellence project, is studying the spread of policy ideas across geographic boundaries, the diffusion of innovation. That's my way of introduction.
So Alan, I think I'll pick on you first. So you'll understand in a minute why I asked Alan to be the head of our Global Engagement Office, because he has played so many roles in so many places around the world. He has been a classroom teacher, the Australian Deputy Secretary of Education, and the chair of the Education Committee for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So a wide range of experience and in this world. So I have two questions for you. The first one is, given all of those different roles, which was the most eye-opening?
Now, she asked this question of me 36 hours ago, and I'm very glad she did, because I had no idea what I was going to say. But I thought about it a great deal, and the one job that I had that really made me think about things very differently was my first job as an Australian federal government official. I was recruited from the state of New South Wales, and I was put in charge of the international division of the Department of Employment, Education, Training and Youth Affairs. It was big. And my primary responsibility was to grow the international student market of Australia. And I'd been in the job about 2 weeks, and a little thing happened in Tiananmen Square. And the Prime Minister at the time decided unilaterally that he would extend the visas of the 100,000 Chinese students who were present in the country. My job was to tell the Chinese government 24 hours before it was announced. So this was when I had opened my eyes. We went to the Chinese restaurant that was nearest to my office. It was called the Great Wall of China in some palace. And the education attaché was present, and my second in charge was present, and his security guard was present. He was a general in the People's Liberation Army. He'd been sent to Australia as punishment. I'm not making this up. Because one of his children was active in the Tiananmen Square movement. So we did not know that at the time. So I said to him calmly, after the meal had been served, that we were going to extend these 100,000 visas for 4 years. Well, it would be fair to say he levitated. And when he came back down, he said, "What's 100,000? You can keep them." And we did. And to my knowledge, most of them stayed. And the second part of the story was that the Prime Minister thought this was such a great idea that he said, "And by the way, the 50,000 applications that are in the Beijing embassy, I want them all processed." And this is when we found out that the General's daughter was in Tiananmen Square because her application was in full. So what that taught me, it taught me that scale matters. At the time, Australia was 16 million people. And 100,000 for us was a huge population. And for them, it was around the current. And so that's the time my eyes were opened by taking on a different job.
Matt, you talked a little bit about the work that you and Alan are doing in terms of identifying universities that have, again, excellence in a variety of areas. But you and Alan have also worked on another project in Kazakhstan, doing capacity building for the country, and also working to build the first English language university, right? And the first graduate school of education. So do you want to talk a little bit about what you've learned from that work and what that partnership has been like?
Sure. So I think it was 10 years ago now that Alan and I were first approached about a project, and it was a group of people that had been charged by the government of Kazakhstan with creating what they hoped would be their first research university. So Alan and I took several trips there, more or less to scope things out and try and understand what the context was. And it became clear that the first task was to essentially set up an institution that was autonomous. And this meant us thinking through with this group of reformers how to create an institution that within itself, would have shared governance, but also would be operating within a legal framework within the country such that it would be shielded as much as was possible from undue government influence. And one of the really, I think, inspiring aspects of this work early on for Alan and me is that a lot of the people that we were dealing with, Kazakhstan is a very interesting country. It is a country that its footprint is the size of Western Europe, and it has the population the size of Pennsylvania. So that gives you a sense of the scale that we're talking about. It is also an oil-rich country, and it is also an autocracy. So it was an interesting context in which to be working. But the people that we were working with were very sort of progressive, reform-minded, younger people who were really wanting to create an institution that they hoped would really be a catalyst in terms of eventually promoting a much more open society. So they thought they would start with a university in which there would be open expression and academic freedom. So we sort of were involved in the project early on that way, and then that project evolved such that they asked initially if we would come, and you'll remember this, Al, in this meeting, where they asked if we would come and create for them a school of education at the university. And we said, no, we don't do those things. But we said we would be interested in partnering with you so you could create your own school of education. And so that really began a partnership between Penn GSE and colleagues at the University of Cambridge in the UK and their Faculty of Education, and the colleagues at Nazarbayev University to create this graduate school of education, which they hoped would be promoting new ways of teaching and learning, both at what we think of the K through 12 and also at the higher ed level, that could eventually be a lever for change.
So 10 years in, what do you think are some of the significant accomplishments of that work?
I think that one of the things that the university has been effective at doing is building networks and having convenings in which they're actually leading some of these conversations around education in the country. So I think that's really promising. I think that there are ideas around problem-based learning, around creating curricula that focus on critical thinking and developing a sense of student agency that I think are really, really promising. So I think, but that said, one of the things that we've sort of seen throughout the time is that the biggest challenges are changing people's norms and values and their understandings about what education is and how it ought to be operated. So just one really quick story. I remember early on when Alan and I were talking, one of our very early visits, we were talking to a rector of a university. Rectors are equivalent of presidents in their system. And I was asking him where he saw where do you see your university in 5 to 10 years? And if you were to ask that question to a president of a university in the US, they would have some answer for you. It might be a bunch of malarkey, but there would be some answer that would roll off their tongue about where you're going to be in 5, 10 years. And the response by this rector was, you'd have to ask the ministry that. If you fast forward to our most recent site visits that we've been doing in the country and you talk to rectors, now they talk about their strategic planning efforts and the efforts that they're actually doing in their institutions and with their oblasts, their state government officials, to try and think about how their institutions can serve the constituencies. That's a huge mental distance to traverse, and so to see the work that they've done to do that has been really impressive.
Amina, so much of your work has been studying immigrant and refugee children here in the United States, and this is obviously a huge issue right now. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about some of the challenges that children of either immigrant or refugee status face, and what schools are doing to support them.
Thank you for that question. There are, of course, a variety of challenges that migrant children face, whether they are voluntary migrants or involuntary, or they're recognized as resettled refugees. And some of these challenges include interrupted formal education, poor quality past schooling, multiple countries that they may have lived in beforehand and had experienced different educational systems and different languages. Also, trauma is a big issue that comes up even amongst immigrants, not just amongst refugees as well. And then on arrival here in the United States, there's a whole host of other challenges. Experiencing a new educational system, a new way of learning, new pedagogical styles, and this is all new information that these young people all of a sudden are exposed to. And in the limited time that we have, I'm just going to focus on 2 issues that impact migrant children, whether they are recognized as legally as refugees or as immigrants, either way. And the first is pertaining to the issue of language. A lot of migrant children, not all of them, but the vast majority are English language learners. And they often come with multiple language repertoires, even though those are not recognized as an asset. And so most of the programs that are supporting these children are supporting their English language development, for example. And this is important, but it's also important to leverage and think about the multiple languages that these children do bring, and what are ways that schools and teachers can actually use these languages as an asset, what we call translanguaging. And so teachers and schools need to recognize these assets that the students bring, and figure out how to support fluid language practices. And so, and there's a real opportunity in looking at the full language repertoire that children have. And so rather than just focusing on English language competency and getting kids to a certain level before you start exposing them to academic content, you can actually do these together simultaneously, and there are ways to do this. And so this does require redesigning curriculum, instruction, and teacher professional development from a translanguaging standpoint. This means having appropriate materials in multiple languages for the children to be able to use, organizing the classroom as a multilingual space, grouping the children sometimes according to their strongest language, and other times according to English language or whatever the dominant language of the school may be. And of course, teachers need to be taught how to use these kinds of newer ways of teaching and learning. And it's not impossible. There are schools that are doing this. For example, there's the International Network of International Schools. That's just one example of schools where you'll see a lot of this happening, and where these teachers are really taking more of an asset-based approach to leveraging students' background and skills and trying to make the most of it in the classroom. So, and knowing your students is really key to this, really understanding who they are. The second issue that I want to talk about is really this increasing anti-migrant sentiment that we are seeing across the world, and of course the US is no exception to this. A lot of immigrant children and refugee children are discriminated against, and not just by peers, but also by teachers. And so one of the things that schools really need to be doing better is addressing the xenophobia at all levels. So this means the peer-to-peer level, but also the teacher-to-student level as well. And it's not just schools that actually have migrant populations that need to be doing this. Even schools that don't have a single immigrant child or a refugee child in their schools need to be thinking about this. I was thinking again recently about that example, that school in, I think it was Idaho, where the teachers on Halloween dressed up as the Wall, thinking that was, you know, a funny idea for Halloween, but just how hurtful that must have been for so many communities. And we tend to focus on creating interventions in schools where there are these populations, but again, this is something that all schools can benefit from and needs to be addressed. And I think there's a real opportunity about thinking about these issues in teacher education programs. Some of the coursework that teachers will do, for example, here at Penn GSC, will be about teaching diverse learners, but it tends to focus on language issues or special education issues, and not taking up some of these bigger issues of citizenship and what does it mean to be in a pluralistic country and what does it mean to belong. These kinds of issues are things that I think we really need to be thinking about, especially since, you know, this morning, Dr. Nasir, if any of you were at the GSC commencement, you may have heard her say in her talk that by, I think, 2065, we're going to be a majority-minority country. It's going to be a very different country that we're going to be living in. And so how are we preparing our future leaders, our children for this future that is really quite imminent? And so really offering targeted teacher professional development opportunities that can help teachers and schools better understand these children, whether, you know, refugee children, immigrant children, or just these issues, even if you don't have those kids in your classrooms, is really, really important. And I hope we'll be seeing more of that. I hope GSC will be a leader of that as well.
Great, thank you. Crystal, as you mentioned, a key theme of your work is political engagement and activism among youth. And you particularly focus on Africa, which is a very young continent, so it's a particularly relevant topic there. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the phenomenon you're trying to study, how you study it, and what you're hoping to learn.
Great. So I'm grateful for you mentioning how young of the continent, the African continent is. I don't know that most people recognize the fact that the continent, which we know is hugely populous, has over 1 billion people. 70% of that population is under the age of 30. And in addition to having,
a lot of people didn't know that.
it's a shocking, you know, demographic reality. But in addition to having such a large population under the age of 30, the average age of leaders in African countries is around the age of 70. So I think we can probably imagine using logic and the things we understand about the world to see that this is not just an economic sort of contradiction or a social contradiction, but it's also a political contradiction when you have such a large portion of your population who is sort of operating under regimes that are not representative for them. And so my work is really much trying to understand how young people navigate this reality. So my first project, which is a book project in an ethnography, I'm an anthropologist by training, is called Political Training Grounds, Schools and Youth Power in Nigeria After Democracy. And it is an ethnography of university student politics and activism after Nigeria's transition to democracy. In this particular context, this is really the first generation after the transition from almost 40 years of military rule. So that particular project is really trying to understand how this sort of rising generation of young people is understanding what it means to be political subjects, right? They're trying to learn what democracy is, what it can be, but they're also having to negotiate the fact that the political structure itself does not present many opportunities for young people to participate. And so one of the key findings for that work, which informs the rest of the research that I've taken up since joining NGC, is that students are really, and young people are really navigating two different possibilities. One is activism and a kind of agitated stance against the state, which is a sort of historical model of political participation and action that has been tremendously successful in leading to the demise of military regimes. In addition to that, however, with the sort of opening up of political structures to democracy, young people are also imagining what it would look like to engage in elected leadership, even though it's tremendously challenging as a young person to get into formal leadership, because very often it's these sort of regimes of old men, usually, who make it so that unless you sort of pledge allegiance to a particular person or a particular party, it becomes very challenging to find a pathway to engaging in leadership. And that contradiction, as I'm calling it, has really informed more recent work that I've done. Currently, I have a project that was generously funded by the Spencer Foundation to map and track school-based protests throughout every African country over the past 20 years. One of the reasons why that is tremendously important is because there's actually not a lot of data on recent school-based protests. In the course of doing research on the African continent, I've lived in universities over the past 15 years, and if you've spent any time in African countries and in African educational institutions, you would know that protests of various kinds are such an everyday phenomenon. A lot of times they relate to infrastructural issues like electricity, like water. A lot of times they relate to larger political questions related to leadership and autocratic regimes. Very often they also relate to the suppression of young people's activism. In many contexts, young people and students in particular are really prevented and punished, often quite harshly, for engaging in forms of protest. And so this work is really trying to build an archive where there isn't really one. And so over the past 2 years, we have identified over 1,100 incidents of school-based protests throughout the entire African continent, some led by students, others by teachers who are woefully underpaid, who are also fighting for their own sort of rights and, often to be paid adequately to enable them to be the kinds of educators that they desire to be. And so that project continues to unfold, but one of the wonderful things about it is that it is a digital research initiative, which means that in about 6 months, you'll be able to go to schoolprotests.com and view an interactive map that will allow you to learn about the school-based activism and political actions that are happening in every African country that we've been able to identify. You'll be able to click on each incident and learn something about what has generated or catalyzed that action, who was involved, what the interests were, what the nature of the protest actions themselves were. And for me, this is an incredible way to, number one, study something that is understudied, which is I think, very important to our work as scholars. But in addition to that, by making it be a public-facing form of scholarship, that means that my young folks that I know from my research in Nigeria or South Africa or Kenya can access this information. They'll also be able to contribute to it and let us know if we've missed incidents of protest that they know about. And hopefully this will also send a message to other researchers that, hey, maybe we should focus our attention in this area. There are tremendous things that political actors, young people are engaging in that we should also pay attention to and learn from.
So Crystal, let me follow up on that. And your work is very much seeking to increase Africa's presence in discussions of global educational and political landscapes. And you're seeking to illuminate that in lots of different ways. Can you tell us what you feel has been missing from this conversation and how you're trying to address that?
Sure, thank you. Well, one thing is that, a lot of the absence is just, it's not just an absence around particular thematic issues. Very often, things that are happening on the African continent are not brought up at all, right? So when we think about even the composition of a lot of schools of education around the country, very often you will see that there are no scholars represented there who do work in this region. I've already sort of indicated, we're talking about such a populous part of the world, right? I mean, that alone should, I think, legitimize the need to pay attention to this huge part of the world. I mentioned how much of that population is under the age of 30, but also, you know, if we're talking about sort of demographic forecasts, by the year 2050, the UN says that 1 in 4 young people are going to be from the African continent. So for me, that means that, you know, there are sort of intellectual consequences for not paying attention to this part of the world, but I also think there are social and political contexts. And I'll elaborate on that just a bit. So one of the ways that we see Africa being described, I think, and of course I'm speaking in generalized terms, but very often in these conversations about education or, you know, social needs, Africa is framed as a site of intervention, right? We need to help the African continent. And there are understandable reasons why we might have that posture. Africa has some of the worst educational outcomes, the largest out-of-school population. All of that is true. But, you know, there is a danger in having a single narrative, right? There are amazingly creative things that are happening in these countries, in these communities, that we ought to learn from ourselves. In addition to that, I think another thing to sort of consider is we are seeing, particularly with the US and other parts of the world, an increase in interventionism, right? This phenomenon has been called the sort of new scramble for Africa, where we are seeing a vested interest in Africa's natural resources, right? In military interventions, we see that with the US. One of the things that I also study is the increase in educational interventions. I have a project right now that is looking at global interest in developing a new generation of African leaders. There are a number of nations, including the United States, including corporations like the Coca-Cola Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, who are all investing a lot of money in producing a new generation of young people to replace the 70-year-olds that I talked about before. I think there's reasons why we might want to understand better why now, right? And perhaps have some skepticism about what the intentions are. But I think, you know, if we don't study, if we aren't curious about these things, if we don't do the work of understanding these processes, then we are not in a position to have anything to say about them, to make sense of them. And so that is what my work is really trying to do, to have a sense of what these multiple kinds of political processes, this assemblage of political actors, what in fact is happening at this moment, and what might this mean for the future? A future that doesn't just affect the African continent, but because we are a global world, right? What happens there also affects us as well.
Thank you. So, Amina, this question is in your role as co-director of the International Education Development Program, which you mentioned. So I mentioned that 25% of our students are international students, and they come here to study. But we also send students to global internships as part of this program. So I was hoping you'd describe the program and, again, the goals of placing people in these internships, and a little bit about how you go about every year. The students come back from those internships very charged up. So.
Yes, it's quite a process. So we're very proud about our international internship program. We have been doing this for about 8 years now, and we have partners with about 25 organizations. These are large, they can be international NGOs, local NGOs, or intergovernmental organizations, UNESCO, UNICEF, the OECD. So some of these organizations have offices all over the world. And to date, we've actually placed students in 47 countries this year. We're including Bolivia, Egypt, and Italy for the first time this year. So that's about 25% of the countries of the world that our students have had the opportunity to go and have this paraprofessional experience. And so what happens is there's this matchmaking process, and we reach out to our partners, and they express interest in particular positions that they want filled, and we match our students to that. So every internship is a unique match, and every internship will be different from year to year. And the students go, and this is a really wonderful opportunity for them after their coursework to be able to apply what they've been learning in this professional setting. And it's a win-win situation because the organizations are getting very skilled young people, very enthusiastic young people to be able to work on their projects. And of course, our students are being able to apply what they've learned. And as a teacher, it's really gratifying to see the growth amongst our students, and when they come back and they talk about what they've experienced and what they've done. They do a lot of work while they're there to send back reports and things like that. So we do have a record to be able to see the kind of impact that they're making. And the organizations, again, it's a variety of organizations that they're working for. Sometimes it might be, and it's a variety of things that they might be doing. So it might be research. It might be participating, presenting something at a conference. It might be actually collecting data by interviewing people, or it might be desk research. It might be developing curriculum or doing a workshop with teachers. So there are a lot of different things that our students are doing, and it's a program that no other school that I know of with an international development program has been able to replicate, and it's growing every year, and so it's just a very exciting opportunity that our students have with Penn GSE.
No, it is very, and I know how much they appreciate all your work in helping to make those matches. So by now you must have gotten a sense that all of our faculty wear multiple hats. And this is particularly true of Matt Hartley, who in addition to being a faculty member and the Associate Dean, is also the co-director of the Penn Alliance for Higher Education and Democracy, or Pandahead. And this is a center that's dedicated to promoting the public purposes for higher education in fostering open, equitable, and democratic societies. So I'm interested for you to talk a little bit about how the work of Pandahead intersects with some of the global opportunities.
Sure. I think one of the ways in which they intersect is that the international work has been a really wonderful way for different faculty members who are associated with the center to bring their expertise to bear. So the work that we've been doing in Kazakhstan has brought together Laura Perna with her work on access to higher education, Alan and his work on country policies around education and the economics of education, the work that I've done around governance and governance structures of higher education, and there's other colleagues too who each bring their own little piece. And for us to be able to work on those things together has been really powerful, in part because when you're going into new contexts like this, you are marching up a very steep learning curve. And there's, you have to sort of very much approach these things understanding that you don't know very much about their context at all. And certainly you need to, and so having other people learn alongside has been really, really wonderful. I think the same thing is happening again now in the work that we're beginning to take on in India. And so we've, a number of us are involved in various projects, Alan and me, and a project having to do with their Institutions of Excellence framework. But again, it's another opportunity for different colleagues to come together and grapple with these things. I would say the other thing too is that the A for AHEAD stands for Alliance, and that a lot of our work has been building alliance or partnerships with people in those other countries, which have really been indispensable to the work. And so we work very closely with faculty colleagues at Nazarbayev University, doing research with them, and the same thing with our colleagues at the Tata Institute for Social Sciences in India. And it's building those kinds of partnerships, being able to work together, make sense of things, learn alongside each other. That's been really, really wonderful.
Just building on Amina's description of the IUP internships, do you want to say anything about the exec doc trips that
Sure.
give our
So,
students global experience?
One of our degree programs at Penn GSE is the Executive Doctoral Program, which is a program that is designed for higher education administrators who are typically at the level of dean or above, who have never earned a terminal degree. So often you'll have people that they've earned an MBA and they're working as a CFO of the university, that kind of thing, but they've never earned a terminal degree. So this program has a summer component in which groups of faculty will take students, well, beforehand there's a whole series of classes in which they learn about the context. It's often the context in which the faculty have already been working. and then take them to that context where they're able to work with people in that country on a particular issue over a period of about 2 weeks in a very, very intensive way. And Al and I have co-led a couple of these trips together. And I think they really are remarkable learning experiences. I think it's important because it allows students to have that comparative element to sort of see and think about different educational issues across very different national contexts. The other thing that it's been very helpful in doing is it allows students to begin to further hone their methodological skills, because part of what we do is research while we're there, and so they're gathering data, they're doing interviews, they're developing protocols and things like that, and then making sense of the data. So it allows them to get a sense of that before they launch into their dissertation work.
I think it's another great example, though, of the synergy between research and our educational programs.
For sure.
Because I know you've gone to Kazakhstan, to India, to China, to many of the places where you're already doing work and have those relationships. Okay, Alan, I'm going to ask you a two-part question, and you'll get to close out this round. So again, you've had so many experiences, both in the U.S. and globally. And I'm wondering if you can first sort of identify some of the common themes or challenges facing education as you've seen them from these different vantage points. And then secondly, how that might inform the work of GEO, the Global Engagement Office, which you lead.
Thank you. I think the recurring theme of educational policy, almost every nation in the last 40 to 50 years, has been about getting more young people to go to formal learning, be it to complete primary school, complete secondary school, not just go, but also to complete. And then in more developed economies, we've seen slowly the growth of mass systems of higher education, and in some cases universal systems of higher education. And the challenge has been to give those opportunities to everybody within those sovereign nations, be they people from particular language backgrounds, particular ethnicities, particular religions, particular economic strata. And the challenge has been to bring equity towards participation and completion in education. And that's the problem that still persists today. It's the problem that we confront in India. It's the problem that we confront in South Africa. It's still a problem in China, despite very high levels of completion of secondary schooling. There are still mass inequities in the Western provinces, and access to higher education is still very much skewed towards the middle class. And so those challenges of offering good opportunities and chances of success to young people, regardless of background, sexuality, religion, what have you, those are the basic problems that continue. For me, the Global Engagement Office is trying to ensure that young people who come through the Penn Graduate School of Education learn to think about global problems, even when those problems are playing out locally. And we have some colleagues who are very globally engaged. They work in South Philadelphia because they are working with undocumented communities, with immigrant communities, and helping young people and not so young people in those communities get better opportunities and better opportunities for success. And so the Global Engagement Office is encouraging faculty to showcase that work and also to extend opportunities for any young student in, and not so young student in GSE, to learn about those global opportunities and make a tangible difference in the lives of others. So that's what I think the purpose of the office is doing.
We've just launched an RFP for faculty to apply for some funding to redesign their courses to create more global opportunities in a variety of ways for our students, so which is very much a part of that as well. So you can see why we're very lucky at Penn to have this range of expertise on our faculty. I want to open it up now for questions from the audience. And I think somebody in the back has a microphone. So don't be shy. Oh, we have questions right there.
Hi there. My question is for Professor Hartley about the work that you've been doing with the leadership over in Kazakhstan. You were talking about the essentially president equivalents of these institutions and how their perspectives and norms have changed. in this period that you've been working with them, have you seen a similar change with faculty of institutions and how approaches to faculty governance have been incorporated into how the institutions function?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what I would say is that one of the things that you're beginning to see because of the policy reforms is that before 2010, the Ministry of Education and Science, which is very powerful in Kazakhstan, dictated 70% of the curriculum of all colleges and universities. And then that shifted, such that after that time, the universities then had control of 70%. That was really a watershed moment for that country, because suddenly, where everything had been told exactly what you needed to do, now institutions have the chance to begin to innovate. I think the second policy change that occurred during this period is that there used to be a sanctioned list of academic majors that you had to follow. So Alan and I were visiting a university down in one of the largest cities called Shymkent. And one of the things that, and they were able to, this is a university that had a major in design, just generic design. They wanted to do a major in clothing design because they're very near textile factories, and they thought this would be a really important way for us to train our students so that they could get then work in this industry. They weren't allowed to do it because it didn't fall into their framework. That framework has changed and loosened up, and so now they're able to begin to innovate. And you're actually beginning to see those things happen now at some of the campuses that we're in. And I think that those sorts of changes in policy have then facilitated more conversations between the universities and their local industries and their local elected officials to begin to sort of think about how can we sort of like tailor what we're doing to fit more the needs of the locality. So I think you are beginning to see that happen, which is pretty exciting.
I have a couple of questions. You really have me thinking about a lot of things. But one for you. This online thing that you're going to have about the people who do protesting.
Yes.
Is there any danger in that, politically? I mean,
Sure.
I would think, my radar went, when I heard that, because I know that in a lot of countries, they would immediately get into trouble, like in China. And then my other question has to do with what you two are doing and the nationalism that we're seeing here and in so many countries around the globe right now, and how that affects your ability to do global work. So, thank you.
I think that's a really wonderful question, and it's something that I've thought and think a lot about. One thing that I think would be useful as context is that, number one, the digital resource that will be launched does not have identifying information about individual protest actors. And there are also protest events that have already happened. But then I think the other piece of context that's very helpful is that part of the reason why there's not a lot of data that is publicly accessible about this information is that in many of the countries where these protest events are happening, there is government or media suppression of news stories about them in the first place. And we're having to use some pretty creative means to actually find out about these protest events. So we're having to use things like Facebook and Twitter, which are places where young people themselves have positions of, there's a discourse that sort of thinks about social media spaces as spaces in which young people have more authority than in other spaces that they may be occupying and navigating. And so, in many ways, I think that having more public awareness about young people's, or not just young people, but about people who are engaged in protest activity in context in which information about it is suppressed, could actually do the opposite. It could actually provide more protection for there to be more awareness about social movements. It's something that we've seen, for example, you may have heard about the Bring Back Our Girls hashtag after there were several hundred schoolgirls in 2014 in northern Nigeria who were kidnapped, right? So For many weeks, local activists were trying to raise global awareness about the kidnapping, but the government was sort of suppressing that information. And it was with the hashtag that it sort of shamed the government into action. And so there's a way that I think awareness can actually offer some level of protection for political actors who might be facing suppression in their contexts.
It's a very thoughtful question. And the reason that we do the work we do is to build relationships between institutions and between peoples. Because the rise of nationalism and the rise of exceptionalism that pervades governments of all colours and persuasions cannot thwart connections between people and institutions. Because what has happened with the rise of the digital platforms is that the state no longer controls communication. And that's why partnerships between institutions, partnerships between peoples become more important.
You don't see a danger that this could happen, that they could start controlling it? I bet in China they do.
The Great Firewall was built in outside San Francisco. Yes, the governments do try and manipulate and control platforms, but one of the great things about young people is they go to meet, and the economic basis of connections between cities, between institutions, will eventually thwart the dictates of central governments of all colours and persuasions. But if you don't take the time to build the partnership and build the relationship and to learn about the other, you weaken, you leave the field to the state to come back. And so that's why this work is, I think, very important. But if there is a danger, yes.
The only thing I would add is that I agree entirely with what Alan's saying, that it's very much about relationships in terms of the work that we're doing, but doing this work, you can't help but feel that many of these reforms are really quite fragile because they're operating within a particular policy environment that could quickly be undone because they require resources, they require energy, and so if there's a change of regime, if people suddenly decide that they want to do other things, and we have certainly seen countercurrents of that in both Kazakhstan and India and Indonesia. I mean, in any place where you're working and there's an environment, there's a counter trend happening somewhere. And so I think that you're right, that whenever you're doing this work, you are always working with institutions that are trying to find their own way in an environment that is often shifting around them, which is really challenging.
If I have one more question. Thank you very much. I guess my first question would be, did you vote today? I'm from Australia.
On November the 11th last year, I became a citizen of the United States.
You still have the accent. I don't know if you knew that.
I guess that is. Anyway, my real question was, and I don't mind who answers this, I'm coming from a diagonal perspective. I went to school here, but I also went to school in Australia, and I'm a teacher in Australia. A lot of the US research, it sounds like your research is about what can the US give the world, and I just wonder what you feel the world can bring to the States. What can you learn to bring to the American system?
Okay, so one of the things I would say is that one of the things we've been very clear about is that we are not about bringing the US to the world. So a lot of these partnerships have been co-learning along with other people. So part of what you're trying to understand is their circumstance and trying to help puzzle through things alongside them. And as you do that, you rethink how you're doing your own. One of the things that's been wonderful about this work is the questions that you encounter. So one of the things that Kazakhstan decided to do was to create an alternative system of accountability for their universities by creating boards of trustees, which is something that many countries do in their context. And one of the early conversations we had with policymakers, and they were sort of trying to learn more about these boards and how they function in different national contexts and so forth, is that someone raised their hand and said, "Why would anyone want to be a board member?" That's a great question. That's kind of a fundamental question, actually, about boards. So there's ways in which we can engage in those dialogues and begin to do these things if you look and see things in brand new ways. And so I certainly think that we have learned a lot about our own system by trying to understand how other people are making sense of what works for them in their particular context, and that's been really rewarding.
So first, let's have a hand for our... I think you can see that Penn GSE is committed to addressing educational issues, not just locally, but also globally. In all of the work we do, we try to, again, increase educational opportunity for young people to help our students see that many educational challenges we confront locally also have global counterparts, and we can learn from that global counterpart. So both taking people abroad to learn, bringing people here, having the kinds of partnerships and exchanges that enrich all of our thinking around common pursuit of educational opportunity is, I think, what motivates this work. So thank you all for being here today, and I invite you to join us in a reception that we'll be having, I think, next door, to continue conversations and also to celebrate some of our alumni. So thank you so much for being here.